So welcome to Boxcars 40K podcast by Warm PL YouTube channel. It is the first episode of season 2, and right away I have a great guest, Ryan Snydler. Did I say it correctly? Or?
Oh, it's actually Snyder. So no, there's
Snyder.
no L. Yeah, that's the first time I've seen it spelled that way, though.
Okay.
That's awesome.
First at something, at least. So, Ryan, at least I can say Ryan without many mistakes. Can you tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm here in the States, living in Pennsylvania right now. I've been playing 40K for a while. I started playing back in high school. I was in pretty much exclusively 40K, but I also did the Lord of the Rings tabletop battle game and Warhammer Fantasy at the time. And then I kind of really focused on 40K, and then I joined the Marine Corps and kind of got out of it for a few years, and then I came back for a couple of tournaments in 7th. Wasn't really a big fan, and then when 8th came out, I got back into it for a short time. I kind of took a break, and then I really kind of invested in it, the whole ITC circuit and stuff, and I've been really hitting the ITC hard for almost, I want to say it's like a year now. Like a strong year, so like half a season. It was like a third of a season, and then I'll be closing in on a full season here pretty soon. So,
so you are a veteran of wargaming, I would say.
I don't know if I'd call myself a veteran. I mean, there's a lot of guys like yourself who's got many years of experience. I mean, I think I'm more or less. I'm just a zealous, maybe a zealous acolyte. when I get involved, I really put a lot of thought and effort into it. I really enjoy, trying to be the best that I can be at the things that I do. So, I mean, collectively, I don't think I have more than 5 years of experience, playing war games, particularly tabletop battle games. But I like it. I enjoy it, and it has always been something I've really invested in. So
many people don't understand that actually putting a lot of effort is what makes a great player great, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
This is not something that comes to most naturally. You have to really invest time, mostly time, into that to become good at tabletop. So because it's a season 2 and season 1 was about War Machine and Horse that I used to play. Now it's season 2, it will be about 40K. So most of the listeners will not know me. I'm Marcin, and I play tabletop games for now 27 years. And I started at age of 15 playing 40K just casually. Then after a few years, it just turned into more competitive. I had some successes in 40K, but somehow Flames of War drew me in because of the historical angle, and I love the tanks and everything. So I played 7 years Flames of War. I was really invested in that, and also had great successes with my team, with my friends. We won ETC, so European Team Championship, 3 times in a row, and then in the 4th year we played 2nd, which ended in that 4th year, the 2nd place ended in a huge drama, and I was really angry with all the situation, so I just quit Flames of War and I started playing War Machine. And then played War Machine for 4 years, and kind of I really loved War Machine, and I still love it. It has great models. It is very competitively set game, so I really like it. But my local meta just died out. People just quit playing generally, or quit playing War Machine, and I was left all alone, so I didn't have anyone to play against almost. So I looked at 40K, my old love, so to say, and there was like 20 guys playing regularly. So I said, okay, screw it. I mean, I will just start playing 40K because that's what's available in my area. And it was like a year ago, and man, I don't regret it. It's really great. The game became something I would never think it will become, and I really like it. So now I'm
I
here.
agree. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it was kind of similar for me. Like I said, I started out Lord of the Rings, and nobody played that. I had a couple of neighbors that played it from high school. And then I got into fantasy, and they had maybe an odd tournament here and there, but it was really 40K where all the people were at. Everyone was playing 40K. So that's kind of the same thing that kind of drew me in. And that's not to say that it's not, it's a great game in and of itself, but I think, it just has a little bit more of a draw, for whatever reason. I don't know if it's just the tanks and stuff, that it's more popular or what, but yeah, it's definitely.
I have no idea what's the success of GW and 40K. The word, the histories behind it are great. So some people are drawn because of it. The models are very good. They are probably the best company producing models currently. So all of this all together, and the game also from the competitive standpoint currently, it's in my opinion, at a very, very good spot. It never been better, I think. So maybe the COVID-19 situation is a setback a bit, but the events are happening nevertheless, and people are playing still. So
yep.
So this is something. Okay, so I ask you for this interview, so to say, because I myself play Adeptus Custodes, and I saw there is a lot of Adeptus Custodes players, but not many of them reach top spots at the events, and you are one of the few who manage that. So I was really interested in the story behind it. So I asked you, and you were so kind to give this to participate in this podcast. So let's go to the event that you placed third at, right? Iron Halo 40K Major it was. So could you tell me a few things about the event itself before we start with your list and the games?
Yeah, definitely. So the Iron Halo was in a state called Oklahoma. I can't remember the town off the top of my head. But for me, it was about a 15-hour drive. I chose to drive just because it was a little bit cheaper than flying and paying for hotels. So I like to camp out my my Nissan Rogue. I've always kind of enjoyed camping out and stuff. So as long as I got good warm weather or good weather gear, usually I can sleep in my my vehicle and save some money. So I don't really know too much about the venue or anything like that, just because of that.
Okay.
I'm kind of a bit of a unique, I guess, black sheep, I guess, in that most people get the hotel, they, that, that's, but, like I said, I was in the Marine Corps and stuff. So I just kind of developed the ability to pretty much sleep anywhere when I need to and comfortably so. And, so, I mean, I think that there's, it's a, a smaller town, but they had plenty of restaurants and stuff around. And, overall, like, it was a clean, well-run event. They did really good with keeping up on the COVID issue. Everyone was wearing a mask. They had no issues there. Like I said, the venue is very clean, very well put together. Very easy to find, very organized. So, overall, I thought it was a great event. For the amount of people and the issues that are going on right now, I think they did a stellar job.
Yeah, great. But a small town Oklahoma, it wasn't a song like this?
What's that? Yeah, I know it is kind of nuts because you're like, why are because MonkeyCon too is out in Kansas, which is I think a few hours away from there, and yeah, they just have a really strong presence kind of out in the
100 players in a small time. Okay.
Yeah, the Midwest. I know.
It's
they
just
get a lot of people.
Something to admire, I would say.
It is. They do get get quite a bit of travelers because they, being centrally located in the United States, they got people from Colorado and Minnesota, and I think there's people from Texas that all show up, and then you'll get people like me from the East Coast as well. kind of make the trek. We had, I know there was some people from Florida as well. So I don't know if it's because, like being a smaller town, maybe airfare is a little bit cheaper or what. I don't know exactly what, brings it all together. But I do know they have a strong gaming presence there, and they do make it happen. So it's awesome.
Yeah, it is great. They do actually. So
yeah,
mostly that's what matters. So what is your feeling? What was the overall faction representation? Was there a lot of Space Marines?
There was a lot of Space Marines. There was a lot of Harlequins. There was a lot of Custode players actually as well. There was a few Orc players. There was a few AdMech players. I want to say there's probably more AdMech than Orcs. So I mean, it's Death Guard Chaos players, a few Knight players. So I mean, to me it was pretty standard for the meta right now. Pretty standard showing. I think there was 1 or 2 Dark Eldar players. There was no Necron players though. Whatsoever. So I think all the Necrons are kind of just waiting out.
For the new codex.
Yeah. Great. So it was a pretty standard spread. It was for the meta as it stands, all the top meta armies were pretty well represented.
Yeah. Great. So were the lists presented before or available before the event or not?
Yes, they were. Yeah. So they were. I want to say they were. It was like the Monday or Tuesday before the event. I think they posted the lists. So yeah, there was some time to kind of look over things, which for me wasn't huge. I mean, like most of the lists are, like I said, pretty meta at this point. Like most of the things that I was kind of like really having to think through, I already had some awareness of. So things like Harlequins are kind of a bad matchup for me. Not a great matchup for me, I should say. I usually keep an eye on the Knight armies as well, because like triple thermal Knights or things like, I mean, that list particularly is really tough on my army, so I try to keep an eye out for lists like that. But for the most part, it was pretty cut and dry. Like most, you've seen tons of Eradicators, tons of Blade Guard.
Yeah.
Kind of seen a lot more Inceptors now. So.
Yeah, about the Harlequins, if we find the time at the end, I will ask you a few questions about the Harlequins matchup, because I haven't played it, and I know it's a generally historically bad matchup for us. I've seen some battle reports, but it ended poorly for Custodes. So I will just ask you some questions about that. But let's go to the list so the listeners can know. They can look it up in Best Coast Pairings, I guess, but let's go through it quickly. What choices did you make? Because you made some choices that are not usually seen in standard meta kind of Custodes lists.
Yep. Yeah. So kind of, I guess it started when I first got back into 40K, and one of the reasons why I got back into 40K was the advent of Custodes, actually. When Adeptus Custodes came out, I really I meandered into my local hobby shop here, semi-local hobby shop, one day, and I saw the Adeptus Custodes, and I really kind of fell in love with the Virtus Praetor model. I thought it was just amazing. I really like playing.
It is. Yeah. It's a beautiful model. Yeah.
It's a great model. I really like playing bikes, and I really liked, small elite fast armies and knights and stuff like that. I mean, knights as like not knight like Imperial Knights, but knights as in like, old knights.
Medieval knights, yeah.
Yeah, so it just kind of really stood out to me, and that was one of the reasons actually that I got back into 40K. So initially I built a bike army, and the reason why I kind of initially struggled getting back in is because I built the bike army, I want to say like 6 or 7 months after they had first come out. So the meta had already kind of caught up with them. And that was kind of like, I think, Imperial Knights as well. And I think that was one of the big initial struggles for Custodes, was beating Knight armies, because they just kind of had a lack of heavy weapons with all the flat 2 damage stuff, neg 2. They just really suffered against like the Gatling stuff, and like with some of those Knights that can just go across the table, and end up in your lines and just be doing flat 6 damage and, tons of stuff like that. I think they struggle a little bit. I think, they're not as fast as Eldar. They don't have as much firepower as, they have some stability, but I think, the meta was just getting so lethal at that point. The sort of inherent advantages of having a 4-up invulnerable save, wasn't quite cutting it. So I took some pretty hard knocks coming in, starting out, but I was really stuck on the bikes. I really like the bikes. And then, so I kind of took some time off, and then I tried to figure out, okay, how am I going to supplement this? And then I went basically all tanks after that. So after, doing some research, learning the Army a little bit better, what options, we had available. I really liked having some long range firepower, kind of supplement those bikes, to kind of provide a fire base to hold objectives, so you're not getting caught on screens and stuff like that. And you have some options as far as being able to go toe to toe with some long range firepower stuff, and this was, obviously still an eighth where, you could still get out of that 48-inch range, bubble, and there was a lot less terrain, and it was a lot more about, to a certain degree. I mean, it was still about holding objectives, but it was a little bit less than that. There was a lot of Alpha Strike kind of emphasis armies out there. I ran up into some issues with, obviously, the Grav was becoming really popular during that time. So Grav was a big issue for Custodes, trying to deal with Grav.
Yeah, Grav Devastators, you mean? Yeah.
So I kind of hammered it out. I ended up playing almost an all armor list. So the list that I started out in 8th and I really got back to the ITC with was pretty much 3 Caladius tanks. It was an Ares gunship, 3 Palace Grav, 2 or 3 Palace Grav, and then a couple of Dreadnoughts and a couple of bike captains. And that was kind of the list that I stuck with, because I as sort of contrary to the meta as it was at that time, to a certain degree. I knew that I wanted to play Adeptus Custodes, and I knew eventually the meta was going to change in our favor. Eventually marketing is going to catch up, and we're gonna get some buffs. And so I decided, that I would just play Custodes, and I would become the best at Adeptus Custodes as I could possibly be, and just focus on that rather than trying to chase the meta. I think that's a kind of a trap a lot of new players or returning players fall into, is they pick an army, they play an army, they get beat down with it, and then they try to chase the meta, and they end up buying like 5 or 6 armies, and kind of having a sense of sort of being a jack of all trades. You get to, obviously you get to know different armies a little bit better, having to play them and make lists for them, which is something that I do anyways. Like even though I decided that I was going to play pretty much exclusively Adeptus Custodes, I still practiced making lists for other armies just to get a better understanding of how the armies worked and how they jived and how they played, so I could, figure out from an Adeptus Custodes player perspective, what's the best way to deal with that.
Yeah. Knowing your enemy definitely helps, right?
Hang on 1 second here. So sorry about that. So I got back in, and I like I said, I decided that the tanks were the way to go, just because of certain inherent advantages. I just looked at the issues that Adeptus Custodes were facing, and being able to reach across the table and strike at your opponent and still hold objectives and do that decently. So just made a lot more sense to me during that time, just the way that people were playing. Eldar Flyers was a big issue. I ran into some hard losses against Eldar Flyers playing bikes. I ran into some really hard losses playing Orcs with my bikes, prior to this, due to the fact that I went pretty much all salvo launchers. This was before Blast, so I struggled, kind of getting through the Orc block and things like that. So I gravitated towards the tanks for those reasons. They just had the firepower to really pick up hordes. After switching to that list, I had some strong victories against Orcs, being able to just pick up 30 boys a turn with that kind of firepower, being able to chew through grot screens at distance, so that my bike captains could physically get in to go after the characters, the character bubbles that they had, stuff like that. And then the Ares gunship came into play with just being able to essentially go after those backfield objectives. So that was a big thing in 8th was, the Loyal 32 and all that kind of stuff. So they always had these, sort of backfield kind of squishy objective holders. And so, to kind of counter that, I usually deep struck a bike captain, and then the Ares gunship would go. And then between the two of them, usually I would be able to, and usually sometimes I'd field an officiate, an Eversor, something like that, to just basically be a deep strike threat to either sort of keep his, certain power units in the backfield where my tanks could just shoot at him pretty much the whole time. Or if he has to, if he's coming at me, my tanks, they're fast enough to sort of, hit and run while then deep striking sort of these kind of small elite combat units to go in and clear off those objectives and get those backfield objectives for some end game stuff and some kill more points. So basically after, then Iron Hands hit, and, I just, like I said, had to really knuckle down again, because that was a time where it was just like everyone was meta hopping, and Iron Hands was just, oppressive,
all over.
All over, man.
Like Brohammer list.
Yeah, but I found that the tank army had a little bit of a natural advantage to a certain degree, especially against like Raven Guard Sense, with the -2 to charge. I found that a lot of Raven Guard Scent players didn't really want to play my army. They I was one of the lists that they looked out for to try to avoid playing if possible, because it's just a lot of flat 4 damage with those blaze cannons, that 3 plus D3, and then the -2 to charge combo. You drop in a unit of 5 cents, I can, if you don't get that 11-inch charge, it's really easy for me to kind of back off and blast away, kind of thing. So, and then your Scents are kind of foot slogging, and then, just the fact that it's pretty much all armor, there's not a lot of squishy targets for those hurricane bolters that they had, even at -1.
Also, accelerator cannon is also pretty good with flat 2. So if you go
both
through
of those.
It,
Yep. To me, though, like beating Knights, usually when I played a 2-in-1, so I played 2 twin blaze cannons and an Iliastus usually. I sometimes switch that out. I'd go 2 Iliastus, especially once Primaris really became more of a thing. I would sometimes gravitate towards that, but more often than not, I was struggling against Knight armies and really trying to, like I said, the triple thermal Knight, even with that, like that was kind of the boon of my existence. Was my tank list was going second against triple thermal Knights. That was always a really rough spot for me, playing that army. So, I took I took the opportunity to really try to hone my play and learn the game better. And despite obviously playing at disadvantage like everyone else against Iron Hands. And, from there, like I said, I got a lot of really good experience in the tournament scene, and I got a lot of good experience with Adeptus Custodes and just figuring out the army and the lists and what works best. And so honestly, I never really played an infantry Adeptus Custodes army. To me, it was just kind of inherently, I guess, not tactical for the play style that I enjoyed and that I was used to. I just never was a fan of foot sloggers standing on objective getting shot at. I'd rather be able to shoot back. I'd rather be able to maneuver. And to me, that to play Adeptus Custodes, that was pretty much bikes and tanks. To do that.
I think that your approach is more difficult to play, but also in kind of way it's more powerful, but also more rewarding. I would say.
Yeah. I think to a certain degree, that's definitely the case. I mean, I think it's more difficult to play because I think if you're impatient, it is an army that's really easy to kind of play too far forward. I made some very key mistakes at some tournaments where I tried to play too far forward. I underestimated my opponent. I underestimated the counterpunch, and you play too far forward with a list like that. And if your opponent knows what he's doing, it can be really tough when you suddenly lose 2 Caladius tanks. And
exactly.
Wounded, because he prioritized targets and he, knew how to allocate his fire. And like I said, you overextend and suddenly it's a tough fight you're in, And so, yeah, I mean, it is overall the issue with Custodes is that it is a small elite army, and that, if your opponent has the firepower or the ability to take out your units at any given time, it gets really, really tough, kind of beating the Alpha Strike against a lot of these armies. And that problem gets, obviously even worse when you have just tanks and Virtus Praetors, because now your model count is, my model count is about half of that of an infantry Custodes army, so you start kind of going into that, that red zone of like, you lose one unit, it's a big deal. You lose one Virtus Praetor, like it's a small victory for your opponent. You can't.
It's 100 points gone, right? So
yeah, you feel it. You feel it every time. So, but that was another thing that kind of made me better at playing the game, because I really did have to value every one of my units. And I think a lot of people really play into the throwaway units, and this list is a list that naturally will take advantage of that kind of thing, especially with the kill more in 8th edition and now grind them down as a secondary. In this edition, obviously a little bit less consequential, 15 points versus, the kill more was a big point swing in the old IT or the 8th edition. But it is like you said, it is a list that is more challenging to play for that reason, where you really do have to value units, but it is, like you said, also then more rewarding because you really get to use and learn to use every tool in your army, and there's no sense in which you're just throwing units around. You really have to figure out every maneuver for every unit and how they all supposed to work together and what goes where, and really planning it out kind of ahead of time so that you're maximizing your firepower and minimizing kind of the enemy's counterpunch, and then all at the same time sort of coordinating your maneuver up the board so you're holding objectives, clearing the right objectives, not exposing certain units, maybe exposing other units, to try to minimize, those losses and stuff. So I think you got it. Yeah, that was a good way to describe it.
So can you now tell us what your list looks like currently or at the event?
Yeah. So I think I've pretty much settled on a list. I started out playing at Telemon. I included a couple of Dreadnoughts, less Virtus Praetors, but after doing some tournaments and playtesting and stuff, I really just kind of gravitated back towards my roots, and just went all bikes and all tanks and a Ares gunship. So currently my list, initially I started out with a 7 bike unit of Virtus Praetors, 1 bike captain, an Ares gunship, 2 Caladius tanks, 1 of each, and then a 3-man unit of guard with Stormfields and the Sentinel blades, and then a Alaris captain. And I made just a few minor changes to that going into Iron Halo. I split the bike unit to 3 and 4. Obviously kind of making an adjustment there, kind of losing some CP economy for things like archaic genetic alchemy.
Yeah.
But then gaining the ability to do a better stooping dive. So I was kind of finding with just the 2 Caladius tanks, I was struggling to defense my Virtus Praetors from deep strikers. So I one of the things I would use the Caladius tanks for was I would flank them on the kind of the center of the Virtus Praetors. And then, so deep strikers would come in. If they got off that 11-inch charge, I'd be able to stooping dive over the tank, with like a 5-inch charge, depending on, how he, made the charge and where he put the models and how big the bases were and what the terrain was like, all those kind of things. I'd be able to stooping dive, into that deep striking unit. And most of the alpha strikes these days are coming in 1s and 2s. If you look at Blood Angels and you look at White Scars and you look at these armies, they really try to benefit from the charge advantages, 3-6 charge. Or one guy thought he had a librarian with a deep striking or outflanking sense that gave him like +2 to their charge. That helped them get in, and but I need to figure out a way to kind of counterpunch, and it kind of dawned on me like the stooping dive is perfect for that. If you deploy right in those early turns to be able to not only get a charge off in their turn as sort of a heroic intervene, but then be able to strike first. And that, to me, kind of the counter definitely is now for me sort of the standard counter to those kinds of alpha striking armies, Blood Angels and stuff. who really have to think about it now. Am I going to throw a unit down here, get a 3d6 charge off, and then only to get, smash hammered by a unit of 4 Virtus Praetors that is going to wipe my squad out and leave the tank unscathed, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's a powerful tool in that regard, because it does force a lot of those kinds of armies to either be willing to sacrifice their power units to risk them in that way, or play them very cagey, which is once again to my advantage, because I have the speed, I have the maneuverability, I have the long range firepower then to whittle those units down from a distance, if they try to then maneuver on objectives from their deployment zone. So I really wanted to invest in that combo, and having 3 fronts, having 2 tanks on the flank and then a unit in front to kind of fence those deep strikers, kind of became the standard. So I had to split that unit. I didn't have enough points really to get anything else, because the guard and the Alaris always go behind enemy lines. They always do line breaker.
Okay. Yeah. So that I was suspecting that this is their job, so to say.
Yep. So I switched from the Storm Shield and the Sentinel Blades to the Pyrothite Spears, because I found that in a good majority of my matchups that one of 3 things was happening with those 2 units. One, I was able to hide them sufficiently so they couldn't get any shot at or damage at all. They got in the backfield corner. They're holding the line breaker, maybe teleport homer, and they're doing their job. They're getting those secondary points, and that's good. I don't need them to do anything else. The second issue was my opponent had enough firepower in the backfield, turn 2, turn 3, to be able to shoot them off the board anyways. So that was the other issue. Like, even with
despite the Storm Shields,
with just 3 guys in the Alaris, like, I ran into a lot of lists and a lot of players that were able to sort of net a corner, so they leave a corner open for me to deep strike in. And so, I'd go for it, obviously, because that's kind of their role, which, so tactically speaking isn't always sound. But with the list that I play, more often than not, I would be willing to take that risk, just because the Virtus Praetors usually are in range to get line breaker points turn 2 anyways.
Yeah.
So if my opponent is shooting at that unit, trying to take those 2 units out, to avoid line breaker, that's firepower. He's not shooting at the Virtus Praetors, so the Virtus Praetors then usually are in a position to take those line breaker points anyways in turn 2 and turn 3. So I, more often than not, I was willing to I was willing to sort of take the bait, in a lot of those matchups. But I just started finding that the Storm Shields, against mortal wound stuff, a lot of people keep their psychers in the backfield, so a lot of times they were getting hit by mortal wound spam, or, I played a few times where just like an orc, I remember a significant orc battle against orcs that he just fenced his whole deployment zone really well, and he wasn't moving. And he played really strong.
That would be my question. Weren't the players screening out their deployment zones so you don't get the to deep strike behind their lines?
Yeah,
or not very often. They don't worry about four people or four models.
Yeah, it's pretty rare, and it's I guess it's rarer that they're able to do it. So, like, more often than not, if I play an army that tries to screen their whole deployment zone, turn 1, my 2 Caladius tanks are more than sufficient to pick up 1 unit and usually create enough of a gap then to deploy that unit in turn 2. Like, more often than not, the 2 Caladius and the Ares gunship, if I'm playing a heavy infantry army guard or something along those lines that decidedly tries to screen their whole deployment zone, more often than not, I'm creating a gap anyways, and it doesn't matter. And more often than not, they come to that conclusion and instead will try to just utilize the terrain to kind of minimize that first turn alpha strike. Okay. So I haven't really found it to be a problem. The one list that I remember that really honestly, I like I said, I've been baited into it before a couple of times, but the one list that I remember playing that just completely screened me out pretty much the whole game and was effective at it was an all boys, pretty much all boy Gaz centered list. He had like 120 boys, and then he had a ton of grot, and then he had just one big unit of the I always forget their names, the big honking orcs with the combat.
Meganops,
yeah. I was gonna say mech something, but I know that wasn't right. Meganobs, big unit of Meganobs in the center with the custom force field, and he had a psyker, and basically the whole play was he moves his boys up enough to claim sort of superiority on the objectives, put down some banners. He fences his whole deployment zone, and then he surrounds the Meganobs, this big 10-man unit of Meganobs, with a grot shield, and then he basically waits until whatever opportune moment to deep strike those Meganobs using the psychic power from his weird boy.
The jump, right?
The jump. Yeah. So between like Green Tide and the jump, like his army, like it's a really good list and style of play I found, because he can really fence his deployment zone. He can really kind of mitigate alpha striking with grot shields, and then he can really pretty much control the counterpunch however he wants. He really absorbs some firepower with the Green Tide, and so it was a really. I lost by 2 points that game. That was at I think that was at Circle City. Circle City was that game. Circle City team tournament. Great. It was a great game, but yeah, one of the toughest games I played with this new list that just really came down to the wire. So yeah, I mean, it's a rare occasion that I'm not able to get those 4 guys into the backfield somewhere. And like I said, I found that more often than not, just the storm shields didn't matter as much. They didn't really matter too much, I figured it's not like I'm losing the invul altogether. I still have a 4-up invul save, so I opted for the Pyrothite Spears because it gives me just a little bit more of an edge with that deep strike. It gives me another kind of alpha strike where I can snipe characters, I can hit transports, I can shoot at vehicles, and then it sort of forces that dilemma even a little bit more, because a lot of people looking at the board and sword just kind of go, okay, I can kite this unit, I can ignore this unit for a turn, and so a lot of times they won't bother to fence, so they won't bother to screen their tanks in the backfield. But with the Pyrothite Spears, it is an alpha strike that things like AdMech and things like Guard, they really do have to respect at that point, and they really do have to consider how to best screen it out, because that unit can drop down and pop a Lehman Russ tank, or a tank commander, whatever AdMech, Dunecrawler, whatever AdMech armor is playing, So I really found that it had a better psychological aspect to it, in the way of just forcing those decisions and forcing up sort of thinking space for my opponent to try to in that precious deployment time as to how to best deal with this this sort of threat, while you have Virtus Praetors flying up the field and long range firepower coming in from tanks, and an Ares gunship that can pretty much go to any corner. It's a lot for an opponent to think about, especially in a vehicle heavy meta. But even in an infantry heavy meta, it's still a lot for an opponent to think about, because these guys, like, the wonderful thing that I found about this list particularly is it has so much crossplay. So having 2 weapon profiles on the Blaze Cannon, having 2 weapon profiles on the salvo launchers.
Exactly. Everybody would think that having a light army like this will be at a huge disadvantage playing versus hordes, but with the introduction of Blast, and so you can use salvo launchers more effectively, and also double profiles on many weapons, you can actually clear hordes pretty fast. I mean, probably faster than anybody expects who didn't play versus Custodes.
Yeah, I agree, and I've definitely tried to play into that portion of the meta. I think I've won, a few good games, because people look and they're like, okay, I'm playing Custodes, and a lot of people at these tournaments, they don't have a ton of experience playing a lot of armies. So when they think Custodes, they think an all infantry army that's going to be foot slogging up the field with little or no heavy weapons. And all
of the sudden you have 4 Praetors that will shoot 12 shots and then charge and do like 16 attacks, right? So they will clean anything from the table right away.
Yeah, definitely. Those salvo launchers were deadly. At Blast, being just flat 3 shots, and that was another thing that I had to sacrifice, because that was having to split them into 3 and 4. It's kind of like, I don't want to do this because I lose a little bit of CP economy with things like archeotech munitions and the flak burst missiles. Like you can reroll wounds on the with the flak burst missiles. Those lose a little bit of economy with those. In order to really secure sort of that good fence that I have set up. So it does come into play more than just with it does come into play a lot more than just with the Alpha Strike. More often than not, I'm baiting an opponent in, or I'm trying to secure an objective, or even just pushing up the field. I feel very comfortable being able to deploy that forward Virtus Praetor unit and not really worry about getting charged in my opponent's turn, because I have that 4-man coming in behind that can stooping dive, and it really kind of or I'll use a Caladius tank that way. It does create sort of a battering ram kind of situation where a lot of people, they have to sacrifice that first unit, and take that punch in order to counter punch, and it's the stooping dive really makes it a lot more efficient for Virtus Praetors to run that battering ram into your opponent's lines, because they can essentially counterpunch the counterpunch, before it can really land home, and do that while threatening, sort of the center of the board and the center of your opponent's army. So it's a really effective. I think it's better than fight twice. I used to be kind of salty about not having a fight twice stratagem, but that was I kind of developed that, when we had no CP. I just was salty about everything.
Now we have
CP wise, when I was walking into a game with CP, and usually saving it for rerolls, maybe spending 2 on Victor of the Blood games. That was about it. Usually it was like 8th edition. I saved it pretty much to reroll the shot number for the Ares gunship. That was kind of like the main reason I used CP. So I was kind of obviously salty about all these awesome strategies. And stuff,
also that Ares gunship, this is also an elephant in the room, so to say, because once you put it on the table, I think like probably half of the players cannot think about anything else except that Ares. And if they don't, then the half that don't think about that it's a threat, after you blow up one of their expensive 200, 300 vehicles with ease, with the shots to spare, then they will start thinking about it. And this is a trap as well, because it is very hard to shoot down, right?
It is, and it has definitely been the center of my army pretty much since I came back. Like I said, I had some knocks with the Praetors initially, and then I started using tanks. And I tried to drop it from the list a couple of times, just because there was a couple of games where it just completely just whiffed. It's tough because I'd fight Marines and stuff, sense, and with Feel No Pain, and I got 5 shots max with the Ares gunship shooting the main profile, and he does transhuman physiology. I suddenly roll a bunch of 1s, and I'm already flew up field from the captain, and I'd get like 3 damage or 2 damage on a scent unit shooting Ares gunship, because I'd get 1 through somehow. He'd make a couple of 6-up saves or 5-ups, and then he'd roll his Feel No Pain, and suddenly smoke clears, and it's like I did 2 damage to his scent, blasting it with everything the Ares gunship has. So there was a few games where I played where just I was still learning the target priority and how to really use them, and not falling into those CP traps, that eventually it was like, yes. And then Psychic Awakening came out, and it was just a no-brainer for me with Vengeance of the Machine Spirit and Indomitable Engines, and the Grim Responsibility and Emperor's Auspice. Like those 4 strats just pretty much make it an auto take now for me. Like every time. Like the fact that I can, just it's so good now with those 4 strats, and like even with 9, like I usually start the game with like 8 or 9 CP. Like it's still a challenge. The CP economy is still very challenging. More often than not, I've burned through my CP by turn 2, turn 3, against shooting armies, because they're all targeting Ares gunship, and I'm burning 3 CP in a phase, to kind of protect the gunship, which is obviously huge. It works out really good. It's great. Obviously the downside, is that you're spending a lot of CP on defensive buffs. But I found that the Custodes, they don't really rely on offensive buffs like the Space Marines do. The fight twice.
This is correct, right? Because we spent a lot more CP in the enemy's turn trying to defend than we spent during the offensive. We don't actually need too many. Maybe one for double dice on salvo launchers, right? Double damage dice.
Yep.
And that's probably it. Maybe reroll on RS gunship of amount of shots. That maybe the second CP you might want to spend.
Which you actually can't do anymore. So
you can't do it anymore. Okay, yeah, correct.
No, you can't. Yeah, that is something that I've had to. Yeah, so number of shots is one of the things that people are still catching up on big time. Is that because it was so common back in 8th and now in 9th that the command reroll is now specific to a certain a list of certain kind of rerolls. Number of shots is not on the list, so sadly, yes, I can't reroll the gunship number of shots anymore. But I've gotten it down to the point where I haven't needed to. I've played this army so many times now. It is a lot easier for me now to really just develop the target priority and not to fall into the same kind of sink that a lot of people fall in fighting back, of just like not going for those sync units and dividing fires so that, your opponent is, so you're making it inefficient to use things like transhuman, when I can shoot sense and I can shoot your aggressors, and I can do that with the Ares gunship. So the nice thing about the Ares gunship is that I can pick 3 targets with the Ares gunship. So, when I fight knights or I fight things that can make, that can use those defensive buffs, I'll target. I'll start with the Ares gunship and I'll just target 2 or 3 units. And it's, at that point, the Ares gunship is not there to pick things up. The Ares gunship is there to force my opponent to spend those CP. So then I know what I'm going to shoot the rest of my army into. If you use transhuman on that one unit, everything else is going to go into those other 2 units that you have, sitting there guarding objectives, waiting to kind of pounce or go after the praetor. So so I like the Ares gunship also for that reason, because the Palladius tanks don't do that so good.
So I have a question about your warlord and about your shield captain, because these are the warlord on a Dawn Eagle jet bike is a more or less standard in general. Auric Aquilas also, but you have chosen Emperor's Companion and Slayer of the Unclean, which is not so. These are not such popular choices.
Yep. Yeah, and I'll explain why that is. It's basically because everyone who's been playing bike captains so far, mostly in the meta, have played them with infantry armies. And so they like sending their bike captains out on their lonesome, to go and be, sort of that forward threat while their infantry are all sort of getting into place to hold those objectives. So obviously, yes, they want survivability. So they're going to opt for things like Indomitable Constitution, or Superior, Indomitable Constitution, Inspiration, things like that, as opposed to kind of killing power. And the way I've always played is that, I'm kind of I like the strong offense. I think, and I like the efficiency of knowing that my bike captain cannot be targeted when he's hanging around tanks that can keep up with him, and he's hanging around Virtus Praetors that can keep up with him. So more often than not, I'm not using those warlord traits. I'm not using those buffs, because my captain's hanging out around things that, he's getting he's getting the lookout sir protection from. So I lose efficiency then because those things aren't being used. But things like, Emperor's Companion and Slayer of the Unclean are 2 things that I'm going to use turn 1. So if my warlord can shoot his salvo launcher, I'm getting points efficiency turn 1. So he can reroll his damage roll on his salvo launcher. If I roll a 6, it's double damage. So he's adding to the firepower element, and he's giving them, a nice little boost that, with the reroll against vehicles, that 6 to wound does come up more than you think. That 6, that double damage 6 comes up more than you think. And a lot of times I'll lead with him or I'll finish with him for that reason, because I know he can put out 2d6 damage, with that salvo launcher if I roll that 6, and I can re-roll that damage roll, So, I mean, that's a really powerful, tank killing dynamic where you roll that 6 on a knight, you roll that 6 on a Lehman Russ tank.
Yeah, that's a big swing.
It's a big swing because now it's 2d6, it's 2d6 damage because it's Slayer of the Unclean, and I get to re-roll it because of Emperor's Companion. So, I roll a 1 and a 2. Okay, I can re-roll that damage roll. And now I roll, a 5 and a 3 or a 5 and a 6. Now it's, 8 or 11 damage from just him.
Weren't you tempted by Master Strategist for that CP region?
Like I said, that's another one that I think is a little bit of a trap because it's, I like the Emperor's Companion Slayer of the Unclean because it's guaranteed. It's guaranteed rerolls.
Yeah.
It's guaranteed rerolls. If I'm trying to get, an extra reroll on a 5+, for an extra CP, when CP are spent, like, yes, I get it. You're probably going to get, in a game, you're probably going to get an extra 3 or 4 CP out of that. But
realistically 3, because after turn 3 you probably only have 1 CP left. Turn 4, turn 5 you're only using 1 a turn probably. So you get spending 1, you get 2 extra probably.
Yeah, and I've just found that it's just it's as someone who's played Adeptus Custodes pretty much through 8th edition, I'm already used to being starved of CP. So that was kind of an advantage coming into 9th, was like I just inherently was very guarded with my CP use, so it became a lot easier for me to sort of really figure out that economy. What are the strats that I absolutely need to use turn 1? What does that leave me with? More often than not, I've found that I've had a surplus of CP against most matchups. There's a few matchups that I'm doing the Emperor's Auspice and Grim Responsibility for like 2 or 3 turns in a row, and there goes my CP, because it's just they're hammering at the gunship, and I'm trying to keep the gunship alive and get in position and take out his power units, And it's usually against armies like Knights, where I have to put everything in my army into almost everything in my army into one unit to try to kill it, in order to stay in the game, So I haven't really found a need to have those extra CP, and the only situations that I've found was like I really wish I had X amount of CP. It's usually been big hikes like Emperor's Auspice, 2 CP strats, 3 CP strats that have been like, yeah, it would have been great to be able to do that twice or again. And at that point, it's negligible whether or not I'd be able to do that with a 5 up CP regen. And so I look at that and I look at all the advantage that I've gotten from the other 2 traits, Emperor's Companion and Slayer of the Unclean, and it doesn't even compare. I mean, he wrecks characters. I played a Death Guard list, and he picked up 4 characters on his own.
Wow.
4 Death Guard characters on his own because, it applies to his combat attacks as well. It applies to all his attacks. Emperor's Companion is reroll all his damage rolls. Slayer of the Unclean is anytime he rolls a wound, a 6 to wound, he gets those double damage rolls, and so
and also on a charge he rerolls from his lance. So
and he rerolls from his lance exactly. He rerolls the wound. So going against Death Guard, I'm going in, I'm wounded on 3s, I'm re-rolling. Like I'll get 1 or 2 6s very consistently with him, and that's 2d6 damage re-rolling. So a lot of times it's like that one attack gets through. He fails to save on that one attack. It's very easily 4 to 6 damage. It's pretty easily 4 to 6 damage. With that dynamic in place, and that's usually enough to kill a character on its own. You throw in a few Feeling of Pains, and then suddenly I only need like, one of those other attacks to go through. He's basically needing a 3-up invulnerable to survive at that point, and most Death Guard units don't have that. So he's been really clutch, and there's been a number of times where opening rounds he's gotten that 6 off on some tank, and just boom, there goes the tank, and everything else.
I would like to see the face of your opponent at that moment.
Yeah, well,
probably
honestly,
pretty sad.
Yeah, I mean, it is a list that is kind of overwhelming for a lot of people up front. Like, honestly, as soon as I say flat 6 damage when I'm given the Ares gunship stats, from that point on, everything else seems okay. I usually start with the Ares gunship, and I'll start with the Magna Blaze Cannon just to kind of like soften the rest of the army, because Yeah, as soon as you say flat 6 plus D3 damage, you're like, oh, okay, like, all right, okay, that's okay, I got it. That's all I needed to know. Like, um, so a lot of those other dynamics that are actually really, really strong, they do kind of fly under the radar a little bit, and they don't really come up until you're playing, and your opponent by that point is kind of like, this is a high damage army. I just need to expect that at this point, and and a lot of them are just kind of like, okay, yep, picking up tanks, yep, I see how this is going, and they kind of get to that point quick, thankfully. But yes, there are those wide-eye moments, both pre-game and during, a lot of times, especially the Ares gunship. I mean, Ares gunship has been just a MVP for me. He hasn't managed to pick up a knight on his own. That's kind of my goal, is to be able to shoot a knight first turn, kill a knight on his own first turn or second turn. Hasn't happened yet, but he's gotten close. He was very pivotal. I managed to kill a Castellan turn 1 with shooting, which was really kind of a power move for me. It was a moment of triumph for me, which was awesome. Yeah. And then the Ares gunship did manage to kill on his own a Astraeus Space Marine an Iron Hands Space Marine Astraeus grab tank. The big Forge World grab tank with a big anti-aircraft gun on the back of it. He did manage to pick one of those up on his own one game, which was another big triumph moment. So, like, I've had some, really cool moments like that playing the Ares gunship, through this past year and a half that I've been playing it. And I'm really glad to see more people getting into them. I know there's a couple other people now that are really having some good success with the Ares gunship. Yeah, and I think you're going to see, I think you're going to see a little bit more frequently now. And
I think so. I used it. I used it a few times, and I'm very happy with the performance, because 9th edition, at least now at the beginning, there are a lot of vehicles. Even infantry armies have few supporting vehicles at least.
Yeah.
And Ares can deal with those, and the bombs can then greatly deal with hordes.
Yep.
So he's a bit of toolbox, right? And
very much. Yeah, very much so.
What about the second captain that you bring? That you already told that he will be dropping behind enemy lines, trying to get that line breaker. But he also has Eagle Eye for 3+ invaluable, and then Lock Warden trait. So is he trying to kill those characters, or at least try to keep them on their toes?
Yeah, that's pretty much. He's definitely there to sort of supplement that alpha strike. So I get the reroll ones. He is harder to kill. So once they chew through those 3 guard, if they can chew through those 3 guard with Pyroclite Spear, he's a little bit harder to crack. That 3-up invulnerable save. I went with the Lock Warden trait because I've found that more often than not, I am getting charged than shot. So usually when I've had to get engaged in that back line, it's been because I'm getting charged by characters, or there's that Smash Chaplain hanging out around kind of the nucleus of the army. He punches back, something along those lines, and having that Lock Warden trait to be neg-1 to hit against characters, and then that additional neg-1 against their invul save. Again, more of a psychological effect than anything else.
Yeah,
kind of prevents someone from just immediately going, oh yeah, I'll just send my Smash Captain over there. My Smash Captain take the guy. Like it's a little bit more of an even matchup, so that especially against combat armies, they really have to think about what to do. And more often than not, they're combat armies especially are it creates an issue psychologically, because they have to maneuver to counter rather than a shooting army that can sit there and fence and shoot. The combat army goes, okay, if I send my Smash Chaplain another 20 or 12 inches into my backfield, that means he's now 12 inches away from the center of my deployment. He's not probably going to get into combat on the front where he might be needed. So it really does cause a lot of combat armies to try to really bunch up, and then that helps me, pick off throwaway units and then get board control, the early to mid game, and then set up my sort of coup de grace from there. It makes it a lot easier for me to figure out how to use terrain to my advantage, how to stay out of combat until I want to be in combat, and how to maximize my firepower to whittle down those combat units before I throw in the Virtus Praetors. So he's very pivotal in that regard. You need 2 units to get line breaker.
Yeah.
So he fills that role as well. He fills that role also.
So this is guaranteed at least 4 points the round they drop, and
that's
then
correct.
Maybe or probably if you hide them, it's another 4 next round, and then somebody has to go and deal with them. So this is a distraction for the enemy as well. Yeah, that's great. But there is one thing probably for many missing. No Vexilla. I also came to the conclusion that the Vexilla is a bit of a trap because he's expensive. He's not keeping up. He's creating a bubble that makes you play in one spot instead on the whole board of the scenario, and his damage output is negligible. So you're sinking your points into something that you're actually hampering your play.
That's correct. Yeah.
Is it your thinking as well?
That's exactly my thinking on it, especially with a list like this, where more often than not he gets left behind.
Yeah.
So I did play in 8th edition. I did experiment with Trajan and the Vexilla and the triple Caladius. That was a really powerful combination there for a little bit after bikes kind of bit the dust there for a little while.
That's a kind of fire-based style, right? Or a castle.
Yeah. Yep. The castle where you could hide the characters within the tanks, and then they benefit from that neg-1 buff and Trajan's reroll of 1s, which arguably still has some degree of play. Giving that neg-1 buff to 3 Caladius tanks is still pretty strong. But the way that I have sort of moved away from that, the thinking behind it, is that I get more out of an Ares gunship. So if you look at the 115 or 119 points, whatever you're spending on the Vexilla, plus a tank, you're getting pretty close to that 430 mark. A 225 point Caladius plus around about 120 point Vexilla. You're already at like 340 points. So you're like 1 Praetor away from getting a full Ares gunship, which gets an inherent neg-1 to hit because it's a fly. It's a flyer, and then plus all the added firepower, fire bombs, the maneuverability of being able to go across the field. So to me, that was the easy answer for me. And the more that I, the more that I played that particular setup, it really is a trap. Even with Trajan there and the Vexilla, it's almost a 300 point sink. That's just basically sitting there providing buffs to tanks that, with the chapter master rerolls and even just rerolls of 1 plus 1 to hit fly, like that neg-1 to hit becomes very negligible, especially if it's something that you're trying to lean on. If it's like the center of your army, there's a lot of shooting armies that doesn't even really factor in. Usually they're going to kill your tanks one way or the other if they're just sitting there shooting. And then that reroll, and then I found, with the blaze cannon, it's already getting reroll to wounds on vehicles. That Trajan's reroll to 1, just even that was diminished to a large degree, because it was like I'm shooting at the tank's first 2 turns, anyways. So I already get rerolls to wound with my blaze cannon. So why am I going to spend 190 points on Trajan Valoris rather than going 175 points on a bike captain who also has a salvo launcher, who can now add to the firepower versus just sitting there,
Same with Praetors, right? They have salvo launchers with natural rerolls.
Yep. So it just, it doesn't make sense then to try to get Trajan in there, giving them rerolls of 1s, because, they're rerolling wounds on vehicles already, and that's what they're usually shooting at. So it just was a big points thing for me. And I went up against, a couple of really strong matchups that just cornered me, and just things started blowing up, and it was just it was a bad day for Trajan and his Vexilla, because they were surrounded by a bunch of exploding tanks, and I was playing Mortarion list, and Mortarion just warp timed himself across the table, batted the gunship out of the sky after taking 6 damage by Overwatch, and then he just started oozing mortal wounds on my whole army, and managed to survive on 1 wound after a punishing round of fire, and oozed a bunch of more mortal wounds on me, and tanks started blowing up and oozing more mortal wounds on everybody, and it was just one of the worst games I've ever played. It was funny because I was I was actually sick that tournament. This was before COVID. I had a terrible flu, and it was an RTT, but I played 3 Death Guard armies back to back to back. And I was like, it was funny because I was like kind of fighting off the flu, like it was just kind of a standard cold. And I was like finally getting over it, but then I'm like here fighting Death Guard, and it was just I kind of iconic and capstoned it with getting just wrecked by Mortarion. But it's cool because more recently played 9th edition. I played a Mortarion Death Guard list, and it was awesome because the gunship was able to. He went toe to toe with my. I was playing a Talamon at the time, and he managed to kill the Talamon Mortarion, took some wounds, but then the Ares gunship, after blowing up a bunch of Mephitic blight crawlers and plague burst crawlers, last turn was able to basically turn around and blast Mortarion from the battlefield. It was kind of an epic execution moment. Yeah.
Emperor's finest had their revenge.
Had their vengeance. Yeah, it was like the perfect roll too. Like it was like a save or die situation. It was so climactic. It was just one of those ones you always remember.
Yeah. So I think we should start with the games. I wanted to ask you about the secondaries, but maybe you will explain those during the summary of the games you played, because you had some really impressive score. It's I don't know how about the other tournaments, but in this one you had like 91, 100 twice.
Yep.
And then you had 97 and 78. So these are all, of course, you have one lost, 58 versus Imperial Knights, but we'll come to that, how it happened. But the one you won really, really high.
Yep.
So I guess this is thanks to choosing the right secondaries as well, right?
Yeah, and I think for me, it's choosing consistent secondaries. So I think some of the issue that people run into when they're trying to choose secondaries is they try to change it all the time, and they're always trying to constantly figure out like what's the most efficient secondary against this opponent, rather than trying to figure out what's the most efficient secondaries for my army, and then moving from there and sort of moving from that foundation. And I found that that's a much more efficient method, especially with the time, because I believe in clear thinking, and I believe in order to think clearly, you have to be efficient. You have to just have habits and patterns of thought that make it easy to make those decisions, rather than spending a bunch of minutes, turmoiling over a decision that then drains your brain power for future decisions that, might be much more pivotal for your play. So I just as a habit, I always pretty much go with, like, even against the Knights, I go with grind them down. That's my go-to secondary. Grind them down because I have so few units and I have such a high damage output, even against Knights. More often than not, if I caught that rhythm, it's pretty much a guaranteed 15 points for me.
Attrition, kill more.
Yeah, attrition. Yep, kill more. And then the next one I always go with is line breaker, because 99 times out of 100, I'm able to sneak that unit behind. If I'm fighting an army where I have to play really cagey with my Virtus Praetors, it usually means he's leaving his backfield open. If he's coming on with a very strong alpha strike, and I have to really play cagey.
So you are choosing that over engage on the front, which is very popular in tournaments.
Yep, and that has given me the edge, because it's sort of easy point, like as easy points as engaged in all fronts can be. I found that line breaker is much easier. Line breaker is much easier, especially for my army, because my line breaking units are not throwaway units. And I think a lot of people shy away from that is because when they look at those secondaries, they want to use throwaway units, and they look at it and go, I don't want to spend points or time trying to deep strike units behind enemy lines that are just going to get picked up. Especially since he's taking grind them down. And so it's a lot of people. It's like, but with engage in all fronts, I don't have to overextend. I just have to kind of play board control, and it just kind of happens anyways. So to me, it's just it's for a lot of people, it's an easy pickup. But for my army, as fast as it is, I have struggled a lot of times to try to get, just in my thinking, to try to figure out what would be a good maneuver plan for me to spread out that thin. More often than not, it doesn't. More often than not, I need to hunker down first turn, and then I need to choose an axis of advance, depending on my enemy's deployment, that dovetails in with my firing lanes. So I'm getting that really good efficiency, kind of shooting the arrow of my Virtus Predators into my opponent's lines, it's efficient. But as soon as I start trying to spread out and claim those 3 table quarters and stay out of the center of the board, my army gets really easy to pick off. My tanks lose their efficiency and firepower. A lot of times my grind down becomes more difficult because I'm having to shoot at different units. And depending on what army I fight, that can be a really big issue, And so I always try to maintain those 2 specifically. And the nice thing about that then is that they do dovetail nicely as well because, when I play, center board with my main force or to a flank, it usually means that my opponent is feeling comfortable doing the same thing. Usually they're not going to, screen out like the 4 guys that I have in play. Like most people look at that and go, okay, it's not a scent bomb, it's not a graph bomb. Like he might do 1 damage to some unit, this, that, but more often than not, they're not going to take the time. They're not going to make that decision to go, I need to screen out my entire backfield. Because of these 2 units, and so it almost becomes a given that I'm going to get, at least those 4 points. And more often than not, it's like they're getting at least 2 turns out of it. And then more often than not, my Virtus Praetors have already positioned themselves, or my bike captain is already in position to take line breaker points themselves. So for me, it just really dovetails nicely. And it's one of the reasons why I've had those kind of high scores, because that's like 30 points that I'm almost guaranteed every game, and so even like the loss that I took against Knights, you saw it was a 58-point loss, and I'll talk about that in a minute here. But that was one of the reasons why I scored so high despite having such a terrible game, and making some couple of very key terrible rookie mistakes. Part of the reason why I scored so high was just I just was consistent with my secondaries, and I was able to get those secondary points to a certain degree, where I was otherwise predisposed or disposed to trying to fight it out in a bad situation. And then the last one is kind of I have to think through it. But usually, like even that though it's pretty quick for me. Like, so for the last secondary, I have 4 really good options that almost always come up. It's very rare that I'm not able to find one of these options, and that would be assassinate. So more often than not, I'm looking at fighting at least 5 characters, and that's going to give me a max score. Then, if I can score max on primaries, psychic, the Abhor the Witch. That's almost always, if I fight a psychic heavy army, that's almost always a 15-point score that I can get. Bring it down. So if they have tanks, usually they have at least as many tanks as I need to score that max. And my army is just crazy good efficient at blowing up vehicles. So that's almost always a guaranteed 15 points. And then teleport homer is kind of like my Alamo of secondaries. Like it's like the one that I never want to take, because I just hate units not doing anything. I hate having to, especially as few units that I have. Like I like the fact that my Alaris captain can just do stuff in the backfield and be that threat. But as soon as he's teleport homering and scoring line breaker points, for a lot of players, that's too big of a swing to ignore, And so it kind of takes away some of that incognito sense of like, as soon as I pick teleport homer, those infantry units become prime targets, because if those infantry units die, I'm not going to be able to score those teleport homer points, And so a lot of times if I'm forced into that decision, it becomes a little bit precarious for me taking that one, because those units do then get targeted, and a lot of times it can really restrict my secondary point scoring. So so I played a few lists that really do screen the secondaries well, but thankfully more often than not, units that have screened those secondaries off usually leave those gaps open so that at least I can hide those units to max those points. I'm thinking like Space Marine, infantry, heavy Space Marine armies, stuff like that. But even those can be really tough, because usually they're outflanking Eradicators and Inceptors and stuff. And a lot of times it's like, they'll drop those guys in next to my infantry to basically fence a 30-point swing. That's that's a pretty strong move at that point. If they can wipe out those 2 units, that makes it really impossible to score teleport homer for me, and a lot more difficult to get line breaker points, depending on the way he's playing. So that's one of my most difficult matchups, frankly, is an alpha striking Space Marine list that has very few characters and very few vehicles. Is to my army one of the most meta armies to play against. Like, it's one of the hardest armies for me to pick secondaries against. It's one of the hardest armies for me to score points against, because more often than not, the units, are small enough that you can hide them from my tanks. And then the units that are coming in are really strong alpha striking units that can do a lot of damage to my army, right off the bat. And so it's always a struggle for me to get into that fight. And, he recovered, usually that an army like that recovers better from the alpha strike than I do, because he's going to have more units naturally. He's going to have things like apothecaries, he's going to have a little more economy that way, just for objective holding, and with the Ares gunship in play, I'm already down 430 points of objective holding units.
Yeah.
Plus my units are smaller, and so there's some lists out there, that Space Marine lists that still are, that I'm, vulnerable to, but I'm still confident that if I play the game right, if I play the terrain right, I still have, it's still a good even match for the most part.
Yeah. Okay. So now you've gone through your secondaries in detail. Now I can more understand the high scores. So maybe we can start with the game one then of the.
Yeah. So I gotta try to remember. Let me pull up.
It was versus Imperial Fists.
Yeah. So this was a pretty standard. So when I do play Space Marines, that was the way that I prefer it to go. So basically, Space Marine, Imperial Fist, so infantry heavy army. This was a little bit difficult for me to pick secondaries. He did spread the table, which made it a little bit easier for me, instead of sort of hunkering in a corner. I knew I had an advantage of maneuverability. I knew I had an advantage of firepower. He had one big unit of Grav Centurions that I knew would be an issue. Or excuse me, not Grav Centurions. They were las cannon Centurions with missile launchers.
Oh.
So that was a priority threat for me. I got first turn, which was good for me in that matchup. More often than not, this is an army that I prefer going first. I can always work with first turn, but there are matchups that I don't mind going second either. This was a matchup that I didn't really mind going second, because he only had the one unit. He's probably going to shoot up my Ares gunship or maybe a Caladius tank, but for the most part, I knew I would be able to weather that, going into turn one myself and turn two. So it was just a really strong pivot. I deployed heavy. I prefer an asymmetric deployment when I spread out. So instead of trying to evenly disperse the field, I'll usually put one Caladius tank in a corner, maybe a unit of Virtus Praetors with him if I have any qualms about a deep strike, and then I put the rest of my units on the other side, sort of preparing for that deep strike in. So I almost always, I'm either playing I do 1 of 3 deployments. I do an asymmetric deployment where I'll play heavy on the one side, one flank. I'll play just a straight pincer move where I have the hammer of my main deployment, and then I have the smaller, which is also asymmetric. I'll have the smaller pivot of my my deep strikers, or I'll play centerboard. I'll play my full army in the center, leave my deep strikers kind of to have my opponent guessing where they're going to come in, and then just play really strong on one axis of maneuver. So those are pretty much my options. So I don't have to think too much about my deployment, like tank for tank. I need to shoot this unit with this unit. I really do try to stay consistent and force my opponent to just create some holes in his deployment for my deep strikers to come in, and some mismatches as far as target priority is concerned, that I can really dovetail into in those first few turns while I'm coming out with my firing lanes, kind of blazing away through my firing lanes. So this was the one that I played very strongly, I think, if I remember right, on one side. And actually I did play asymmetrically. So I had a Caladius. I had my Caladius tank on the left, and there was 4 pieces of terrain in each corner. So I put down my anti-infantry Caladius tank on the far left, because I knew he would think that would be kind of more powerful Caladius tank in this matchup. So he kind of took the bait. He deployed very heavily on that side. He put his grav sense or his devastator sense on that side, and he put a bunch of infantry with him to sort of, obviously maybe anticipating that the Virtus Praetors would be deployed with it. And then I deployed very heavily with everything else on the other side. And so I was able to mismatch his army so that he had some aggressors and he had some blade guard on the other side, but his firepower was kind of stretched across the board. And, half of his infantry units, the supporting infantry units, and some, combat intercessors and some other things were over on the other side where they weren't going to be able to really add to the fray. His characters were on the strong side. So obviously, as I started deploying strong side, he also tried to deploy strong side too. So, but it was enough of a mismatch that once I got that first turn, I really hit those Centurions hard. Got a 5. I think I got them down to 2 of them. Through the transhuman and everything, and obviously I wasn't able to use salvo launchers against him. So it was pretty much it was pretty much between my Ares gunship and the one Caladius tank that I was able to kill 3 of them. I think nice. I rolled a 3 on my number of shots with a Magna Blaze. So even with transhuman, I did about average damage. So you're looking at about 7 shots that do 4+ damage. So killing 3 of them was about average, which was fine. That worked out. And then I think this is where I dropped some secondary points because I wasn't able to get grind them down due to the fact that I had to put so much firepower into that one unit. So my other Caladius tank shot at a center board objective holding unit and got it down to like 1 or 2 guys, Primaris Marines. And then pretty much the rest of the game from there was mopping up the Centurions, Caladius tank basically holding that flank and just, blasting Primaris. And then the Axis of Advance just went straight at him and just basically punched him down, took that flank. And then it was just basically a pincer move, from there, finishing off, off the pivot of not quite a pincer move, I guess. I mean, the Caladius tank did move up, but, pivoting off of that sort of linchpin of the Caladius tank in the far corner, just kind of basically rolled up his flank and finished the game.
Yeah, so I can understand that the strong beginning when you start and you do the initial punch, it can be so strong with this list that the enemy or your opponent is actually already gave up. I had such a games and I saw such a games that because you have so much firepower and they lose so much in the first turn that it's very difficult to go from there. Right?
Yes. So that'll probably get into the second game. The second game. So that was very true in my second game versus Admech. That was part of the live stream. If I remember.
Yeah. That game is in the live stream. I saw that one and.
So that was, I was playing a guy who was not experienced fighting this particular style of Custodes. I don't think he expected as much. I think, like I said, Custodes sort of play unassuming, those first couple of turns in most cases. And this is really an army that just goes to that extreme opposite of like, it is really strong. It's a really strong anti-vehicle alpha strike, that turn 1, especially if you deploy on your line, which he did. He put those robots right out in front of me where they could be seen. There was no cover. As much as he deployed his tanks in the backfield, he didn't really deploy them in cover. He didn't try to hide them. He just deployed in the sort of the standard Admech bubble fashion. Lots of rerolls, hoping to get first turn. Got some guys on the flanks to rush objectives. And that's what I like to see against heavy shooting armies, because I know that I'm going to deploy KG. I'm going to deploy so that my units are going to mitigate if he gets the first turn. I'm going to keep most of my. He's going to have Ares gunship basically. I'm going to get those, those buffs from the CP. That's going to mitigate that damage for the most part. It's a list that makes it really easy for me to plan to take that first turn alpha strike. But some of these, some people who play Admech and they play guard and stuff, they don't necessarily think that way because they have so many units. They're just like, well, I can't hide anything, so I'd rather just threat saturate. I'd rather just put all my units on the table and maybe force him to make some bad decisions about target priority, and then move on from there. That's usually what I come up against, and that's always going to be in my favor at this point because I've played so many times. I know what units I need to kill. I know the ranges of their weapons. So target priority for me right now is pretty clean cut. I know what like you saw. I targeted the robots. I know the robots are going to take out my Praetors if I leave them standing. And then from there was the not the Dragoons, but the
I think that the robots were one of the first things that we killed, and I would advise anyone who wants to play that kind of list or in general to watch that stream at least the first half an hour or something like this, because that the way you deployed before, of course, rolling for starting, you deployed that your enemy could only shoot probably Ares gunship,
right.
which is excellent because it's very difficult to drop the Ares gunship in single round of shooting. So even if you don't start, it's actually as you would start, because then you don't lose anything, or maybe he brings below half Ares gunship probably. You'll be still shooting at the second bracket, so you are still pretty much effective. You have pretty much effective list, and if you start, then he's in a big trouble, and you can see that on that stream, right?
Yeah, and like I said, I think he could have definitely played that better. I think if he would have tried to use the terrain a little bit better, maybe deployed a little bit less aggressively, forced me to shoot into some pickup units, I think he could have held on a little bit. It would have been harder for me to maneuver my Praetors into the position that I did and to take those two corner objectives right off the bat. I think he could have definitely played a denial game and really drove that score down. I think it would have been probably 70s, just having to then struggle with those secondaries. That's what I would have played. I would have kept those robots in that tight corner and waited for me to try to take those flanking objectives and then jump out with the robots and shoot everything and then try to maneuver. That's how I would have played it. That's kind of how my last game went with the Death Guard. It was very cagey, very tactical as far as like trying to take those centerboard objectives without getting crazy counterpunched. But this guy, I think, like I said, I think he just misdeployed badly, lost the first turn, and then just couldn't recover from that alpha strike, and he just opened it up for me at that point. My Praetors were able to split to take both of those objectives. My Ares gunship basically just dominated the center of the board, and my Caladius tanks just did what they did. They just mopped up, shot things. Kept my Virtus Praetors covered, kept units off them, kept the pressure on his axis of advance. And from there it was just kind of a crumble, so you get those games sometimes, but I think a lot of people don't understand how absolutely key deployment is in this game. You only have 5 turns. It's not chess, where you have like 100 moves to make, 100 turns or whatever it is. You have 5 turns to do everything you need to do, and so there's no reason not to really think through your deployment and especially those opening turns, and then have contingency plans for those follow-on turns, depending on what happens to your army and your opponent's army in sort of those opening volleys and those opening maneuvers.
Okay, so tell me about the game 3 versus Knights.
So this one I'm not proud of. And it was. I think for a lot of people, it was sort of looking at it as it played out, it was a minor mistake, and it was kind of a culmination of a lot of things that kind of went in his favor as well. But basically what happened was, and I still am making this mistake now and then, where I'm trying to guard my tanks rather than my Virtus Praetors, which is just something that I've gotten in the habit of doing simply because I played tanks for so long. So I started Praetors and I played tanks for so long, and that was against the Iron Hands. So I just, especially it's game 3, and so, I just kind of going a little bit more on reflex at that point. And I think this is probably the second or third time it's happened where I've misdeployed my Virtus Praetors. I've exposed my Virtus Praetors to a shooting or a charge of some kind, where I should have rather exposed one of my tanks rather than my Praetors. And it is kind of a gut reaction, just kind of having to hide from Iron Hands, and just always playing tanks, and kind of figuring perhaps that Virtus Praetor is going to have to take some punishment anyways because they're going to be moving up the field. But this was a matchup where we were playing in corners. So I can't remember the name of the mission, but it was, so it was the opposite corners with a 9-inch, 18-inch bubble in the middle.
Yeah.
And very, very little terrain. So this is kind of where the disadvantages came in. So that kind of culminated was the fact that I had very little terrain. Like I had one piece of terrain to try to hide behind. I couldn't even really get 2 tanks behind it. But I should have just put my Virtus Praetors behind it, maybe even deep struck a second unit of Virtus Praetors just to keep them out of firepower. He didn't have overwhelming firepower, so that was one of the things I just underestimated of him. But I still sort of played like to the terrain. So I should have just been like, okay, he doesn't have a lot of firepower. I need my Virtus Praetors. I'll take it on the nose of a tank, and I should have gone from there. But what ended up happening is I tried to hide my 4-man unit of Praetors behind this cargo, these sort of cargo things in kind of the midfield on the short edge, because he had a lot of grav, and again, he had a lot of grav. So, I mean, he had a lot of grav. He had 2 grav armigers, Forge World. So, I mean, these things do flat 4 damage. So, I mean, there was no sense to put that Virtus Praetor unit up there. And he had a Knight Gallant, and I haven't played a Knight Gallant since I got smashed in, early 8th or mid 8th. I played I still remember to this day, I played a really bad game of where it was all Virtus Praetors, and he just sent his Gallant loping across the field and just, killed like 7 Praetors on his own, just smash him in combat.
Oh God.
And fighting twice and all the crazy things, So this guy, he just basically makes a charge with the Gallant, gets into that 4-man unit of Virtus Praetors. I do the archaic human, archaic genetic alchemy. So 2 Praetors die, but now I have a flippin' Knight in my lines. He shoots everything else at the gunship. The gunship survives. I can't remember the gunship was in bad shape, really bad shape. I mean, he took a lot of grav. He took a lot of, he had a thermal cannon, and he had 2 Avenger Gatling cannons, 2 grav armigers, and then 1 of the autocannon armigers. All of that shot into the Ares gunship. So he gets a turn 1 charge off on my power unit, my 4-man unit of Virtus Praetors, and then he basically almost kills the gunship. Like I said, no terrain on this table, nowhere for me to hide. He gets the first turn. So, like, at that point, I'm already looking at a loss. There's just no sense at that point of me thinking that I'm going to be able to pull this out as a win. I knew basically every single thing in that game would have to go in my favor from that point on, pretty much, for me to get that win. And but I stayed in the game. I did a lot better than I thought I was going to do. So I got some really, really lucky rolls. I got some really good big things in my favor. So I counterpunched the Knight. I got him down to like 1 wound. He fell back from the unit of Virtus Praetors. I did a bunch of stuff. Like, I was able to kill he moved his grav. He himself kind of overextended, so I was able to kill one of his grav armigers with my bike captain. I was able to, like I said, I got his Gallant down to 1 wound. And then I managed to, so my Ares gunship surviving on like 1 or 2 wounds was really clutch. So he was able to help bring that Knight down, and then he did a good number of damage on his Warlord Knight, despite the fact that he had a 4-up, base 4-up invulnerable save, and he was rolling hot. I mean, that first round of shooting, he rolled I think 6 out of 8 4-up saves or 7. He rolled, so that was like a big roll too, that first turn that like I really needed to go in my favor. But because the Virtus Praetors were able to, it was like, and he saved like against all these salvo launchers and blaze cannon stuff that I shot. But then what he didn't save against was when I charged him with my 3 Virtus Praetors, they did like 16 damage to his Knight with the Slayer of Nightmares stratagem.
Wow.
And he'd already taken like 5 or 6 from a blaze cannon or something, and then a couple of pot shots from the undergun, the Lastrum. So his Knight, though, survives with 1 wound, and I don't have any. And that's one of the places where I was like, I wish I had to fight twice. because I would have killed that knight.
Did you actually take the secondary to kill Titanic units, or?
I did take that.
Okay.
I did take that. So that helped a lot because I was able then to kill that knight, and I actually killed that knight. So that knight managed to then charge one of my grav tanks, wrecked the grav tank, and then and that was turn 2, and I couldn't move my other tank at that point because he was getting me primary points, so I was sitting on an objective, and I needed to get those primary points, and so I can't remember exact sequence here, but basically what happened was I was able to kill his knight in Overwatch on a lucky 6 from the blaze cannon. I was able to kill his knight as he charged so he killed my Iliastus with his gallant after killing 2. He only killed 2 of his praetors. They fell back. I shot his knight, charged his knight, got him down to 1 wound. Would have killed him if he hadn't rolled so hot on his saves. Got through, killed my Caladius with the Iliastus. I got lucky then in his next turn because he tried to charge my Caladius, which I couldn't move. Everything else shot into his Warlord tank pretty much from that point in those turn 2 into turn 3. Because I got that kill in Overwatch, so the Caladius tank was able to then shoot his Warlord. So I actually got down. He blasted my Praetors with Armiger stuff, so I ended up basically charging his Warlord Knight in the center with my bike captain, and 1 Praetor had survived at that point after I had killed his 2 Grav Armigers, with salvo launchers, and I charged the one and salvo launcher the other, and in that turn 2, in my turn 2, and then I think it was turn 3 that I overwatched his gallant, killed his gallant as he was basically trying to finish off my tanks. My Ares gunship turn 2 shot in death and did a bunch of damage on his Warlord Knight. So I did Venge the Machine Spirit, so he was able to, which was a big swing for me. So I charged. So and then my Deep Strikers come in, and they come in the backfield, behind one of his Armigers, kind of with some cover. And so at that point, I'm kind of there's a glimmer of hope for me, because he's got basically 2 knights left and an Armiger, and I have a bike captain, a Virtus Praetor, and a Caladius tank, and my Deep Strikers just came in, so I knew I had to deploy them, behind his lines, because I knew I was scratching for points. So I kind of wish I could have afforded to maybe be more a little bit bold and went after that other Armiger, but I knew that if I wouldn't killed him, my units would have been, he had still 2 Avenger Catling cannons on the field, and I didn't want to expose that unit to that. So I had to play cagey, and I kind of did a last stand effort against his Warlord in the center of the table and charged him. I got him down to 2 wounds, I think, or 3 wounds, very negligible, and wasn't able to cut it. Another situation where just I really wish. And at that point, I was out of CP. So he strikes back, kills my Warlord, and at that time, if I had 2 CP, I probably could have, I would have fought on death and probably could have killed his Warlord Knight, which I think might have actually won me the game, because it was his Warlord Knight then that, after doing that in my turn, went and stomped forward and blasted, using the CP to shoot on full profile. With that thermal cannon, Avenger Gatling cannon, and the Armiger and everything, he was able to kill my last Caladius tank, which really crippled my my primary scoring. So as long as I had that tank alive and my backfield objective holders coming forward, I was going to be scoring 10 points of primary each turn. So had I been able to kill that center knight, I think I would have been able to swing it. You would have 1 knight left and 1 Armiger to my 1 Caladius tank and my backfield objective holders. But the fact that his Warlord Knight survived, got through, basically drop kicked my Caladius tank, and then was able to hold that objective. Now he's scoring max primary because he's holding 2 to my 1.
So in general, that matchup is playable, winnable, but
absolutely. Oh, absolutely. This was, and that was part of the issue too. Is that initial deployment was partly because of an overconfidence. I had played really strongly against, in my mind, that were scarier knight lists. Knights that lists that had Castellan knights in them. Knights that had 2 or 3 thermal cannons in them, 4 thermal cannons in them, and knight armies that I managed to defeat. So he did definitely take advantage of, I think, a measure of overconfidence there, that he was definitely able to capitalize on very, I guess expertly so. He played very tightly in the beginning turns. He was kind of a happy-go-lucky guy too, fellow veteran. So he had sort of an unassuming nature that kind of lulled me in a little bit to that overconfidence, which was great. I kind of laugh about it now. We had a great talk about it, and he was very supportive of me going forward into that, those remaining matches and stuff. And likewise, I told him, like, yeah, man, you got it, because he was 3-0 at that point. He was just like, yeah, man, I never expected to be, in the meta now, to be 3-0 knight player in a major. I was like, bro, you got to win it now. Like, it's up to you. So I was rooting for him a little bit. It was a great game overall.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it really came down to, as far as my fire efficiency, it really came down to getting that, having that first turn charge. If he hadn't got that first turn charge, I think I would have won it. It probably wouldn't have been a 100-point score. It probably would have been maybe 80. But I think that for me was just the kind of the Achilles heel move that I made. It was just the one that opened the game up for him. And so I lost, so I had to fall back with those Praetors to get fire efficiency on that knight to try to kill him from, stop him from going and steamrolling my tanks. So that lost me 4 salvo launcher shots, which could have definitely swung the game, with 2 knights at 1 wound each, at key pivotal moments. Like, having 4 salvo launcher shots for 2 turns would have been enough, I think, to turn that game in my favor. So that was, and it was a mistake that I think I needed to make going forward. I think that was one of my big Achilles heel things, was just, I had a measure of overconfidence, and it was a mistake that I made before, and with an all Praetor list, but that was literally, 100 games ago. That was right when I got back into 8th. So it was good for me to kind of relive that experience where I'm at right now, to just kind of tighten that screw down and really consider that gallant knight charge, and really kind of reiterate to myself that I need to protect the Praetors more than the tanks.
Yeah, every competitor knows that we learn from losses more than we learn from the wins, right? So you will forever remember that mistake, probably.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that philosophy up, because that's been something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially as my win record now is really kind of surpassing my loss record, and it has been for 6 months or so now, and like that's been. Yeah, like that's been like the number one thing for me, is like, how do I remember the losses? And like that's been a struggle, is like remembering those mistakes that I made and not getting complacent and making them again. And that was exactly what happened at this major. Was I made past mistakes that I should have learned from, but because I've been doing well, I got complacent, and an opponent was able to turn the tables on me, and take advantage of that. So, but I've also been really kind of developing a little bit more of a kind of a philosophy of victory too, and like in that, like, yes, there maybe some degree that those losses are more memorable, but I feel like there's so much to be learned also from victories, and like doing really well and learning from that, because that's honestly what people want to hear about. They want to learn how to win, and so they want to learn then from your victories in order to sort of to do that themselves, and so
Yes. This is why we have that podcast now.
Right. Yeah.
To learn from your mistakes, but also the good plays, so we can duplicate that.
Right. So, but that is a more complex equation, because we are in a competitive environment, where it's not like I'm playing for, a team necessarily, where like I know I'm fighting this team, like all individuals. So I run the risk of like sort of selling the secret, to a bunch of people, and then suddenly I'm not doing as good because, but that what makes the game so good, because then I have to adapt again, and so like learning those rhythms of like, how do you maintain a success? How do you maintain, a success rate in a constantly adapting meta where you're being more and more exposed as a top player, to all kinds of meta change and all kinds of adaptation, where that next best player might be right around the corner, but you're not expecting it because you have so many wins under your belt, kind of thing. That's been a really learning experience for me. I had a great game with Brad Chester, who is the guy who played Richard Ziegler at LVO at a friendly tournament before MonkeyCon, and I really learned a lot from that. I did lose to him in that game. He actually completely denied me primary points. I made some key mistakes again as well in that kind of deployment. Spread too thin, very basic common mistakes.
Play Marines or?
He played Marines, yeah. He played White Scars, Salamanders. He played Salamanders. He had the triple Eradicator units. He had a big unit Inceptors. I mean, he played a very tough competitive list and a very tough competitive game for a friendly tournament. But it was friendly to us because, we both at that point were, obviously he has got a much more distinguished reputation than I. So, but as far as like competitiveness, like, he was being competitive, I was being competitive. We both had no problem with that, despite the fact that it was a friendly tournament. It's kind of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So great game, but it was good just playing with him and observing his behavior and figuring out, how, it really does start you really do start having to play the player rather than the list. Once you kind of get that victory record under your belt, it really does become more of like a psychological game where you're trying to figure out what your opponent's going to do rather than trying to just figure out the list. Because the list. You've played the list. Lots of people have copied him, played his same list. You've prepared for it.
Also, see his mistakes if he makes any and then capitalize on them. Because
exactly.
Those one or two mistakes that you notice and capitalize on might mean a game in such a tight moment.
And then recovering from those mistakes. So he actually made some pretty big mistakes early on in the game. He basically fed me his Centurions. He fed me his Aggressor Squad. I was able to kill both those units right off the bat, but then it was his Alpha Strike that really turned the tables on me. And the fact that it was another situation where terrain was not in my favor, and then the mission in this case was not in my favor. So this is a mission where it required you to hold 2 in order to score 5 primary, 3 for 10. So it was tough for me once I got hit with that Alpha Strike to hold objectives. And he was smart, obviously as experienced as he is, he knew that. And so instead of targeting my Ares gunship, which survived at the end of the game, he just targeted my other objective holding units. And so basically what ended up happening was, he made a good calculation early on of, kind of spreading the field, forcing me to kind of split up my units to hold objectives, or at least baiting me into that. I didn't necessarily have to do that, which I shouldn't have done that, but I kind of got overconfident because he had such a big Alpha Strike. He hid so many units, behind terrain. So I was like, okay, the field is mine. I should capitalize early on some primary points. I have the speed then to kind of bunch up when I need to, and, he got first turn and that Alpha Strike came in turn 2, while my army was already, still spread out. So he was able to pick his targets as he wanted. And then I forgot to use Vengeance of the Machine Spirit. So that would have been a clutch move for me. So he came in targeting my Caladius tanks. And I'm so used to using Vengeance of the Machine Spirit on my Ares gunship that it didn't occur to me that I should try to use it on, my Iliastus Caladius tank to try to pick up one of his units of Eradicators. So that was kind of an afterthought of like, he deep struck 2 units of Eradicators on one side, 1 on the other, pointed at my 1 tank. He shot the 1 tank first, killed it, and then what I should have done was, with 2 CP, I should have shot that main gun into that other single unit of Eradicators. Probably would have saved that other tank. Well, he comes in, he shoots for the Eradicators, gets a good roll, he kills my other tank with 1 unit of Eradicators. So counterpunch was killing the Eradicators with bikes, what I had left, and then basically trying to survive with the Ares gunship flying around blasting stuff while my deep strikers come in and basically hold 1 objective. But it wasn't enough. I needed to hold 2 objectives. So everything else had to push forward to try to kill stuff, and I just couldn't do enough damage in that turn. He had the unkillable, quote unquote unkillable captain. a really tough to kill salamander captain who was just driving around being a threat. And, but yes, it was a game where like I learned a ton. Like I learned way more, yes, from that loss than I think I would have from a victory. But it's more challenging, I guess, to learn from your victories because there's a lot, it's a lot more fine-tuned stuff.
Yeah.
But I think because it's more challenging, you do get a different thing out of it, than you do from the defeats. The defeats are just rote, like the mistakes become really apparent to you. You don't have to really think about it too much. But when you're trying to learn from a victory and trying to improve on it, it really is more of a challenge because you're trying to get less. There's less there for you to just sort of really ruminate on and go, okay, that was a mistake. I did that wrong. I need to do this, kind of thing. So.
Also, fine tuning your list when you play. It's you have to reflect afterwards. Well, like Vexilla did almost nothing. He was just standing behind, let's say, Telemon or something, giving his -1, and actually nobody can kill Telemon so easily anyway. So I just had a 120 points dude standing whole game. Is necessary. So that's also a step by step you can fine tune your list and also what did I do right? Did I spend my CPs correctly? Did maybe not spending those CPs like would have mattered that much or not? Yeah. So
I think for the Vexilla, I think there's still some play. So if I was going to play a Vexilla, and I did consider this when I was transitioning away from the Telemon. Was instead of because those line breaker points and the Dreadnoughts are not huge units. They're a little bit less conspicuous or a little bit more conspicuous than the way that I'm running it. But if you really love the Telemon and you really want to play a Vexilla, the way to do it is to put him in Terminator armor and then spend 1 to 3 CP deep striking 1 or 2 Dreadnoughts with him. And then just throwing those into your opponent's line breaker, doubling that. You'd have to double that with something that's going to punch that hole in their backfield so that doesn't get fenced. And then picking up line breaker points because then you're really, and then those are units then that you can push forward to try to take whatever backfield objective he might be puppy guarding, and then really pressuring that front line. So even if you play an all infantry army with that kind of deep strike, it's going to help a lot alleviate that pressure, and then you're absolutely going to max those buffs. Your Vexilla then is not just standing around, but he's scoring line breaker points, and he's protecting 2 units that are going to take a lot of firepower, and it's going to force your opponent then to target those units, So if I was to play, if someone's listening and they really want to play their Vexilla and they really want to play their Telemon, that's the way that I would do it. I would switch out those, and that's the way I did it when I played in 8th and when I played Dreadnoughts in 9th, is I always deep strike them. I always put them in the deep strike. My tanks were fine. They have -2 to charge. They can move out of, I always deep strike them. They'd always go for an objective. They'd always be a kind of an issue. They can hunt characters really well, especially the Killis. Having that 9-inch move and the D3 mortal wounds on a 4-up on the charge and the flat, it's a D6, 3 minimum damage with 4, possibly 5 attacks for ruling charges. Like you give him a couple of Adrastic Destructors, he's an excellent character killer, excellent backfield character killer. So if you want to play Dreadnoughts, if you want to play the Vexilla, that's the way I would run it. I would deep strike him. I'd put him with a Dreadnought, and then I would go after a backfield objective while picking up line breaker points. That's to me the only way to play that combo.
That's a scary thought. The Telemon Dreadnought behind the enemy lines.
Yeah. That's But what I see more often than not is that people play infantry lists and they use them as sort of a And a lot of times, yes, he absorbs some firepower turn 1, turn 2, but against things like Harlequins, against things like Admech that can put out a lot of mortal wounds, a lot of those buffs and toughness and vulnerable save just don't do it. And it doesn't have enough firepower on his own to really, be a counterpunch to some of those faster units that that deal out those mortal wounds. But at least if you put him behind enemy lines, you can really it is kind of like a redeploy, in that your whole enemy army is on the table, so you can put them wherever you want. You can maximize that cover, and you can put them in a threat range, an immediate threat range, where you get to basically choose then what units are coming at them, or you can place them in such a way that'll draw a unit back that maybe is pressuring your front line too much, or going after your gunship, maybe threatening your gunship or something. If you're playing gunship as well. I've never been a fan of the static defense, especially with Custodes, because as tough as Custodes are, there's just so much out there these days that can either outlast Custodes, like Death Guard, toe to toe. Death Guard are gonna outlast Custodes. It's the way it is.
Yeah.
When all their vehicles can have 4-up saves and they get a 5-up film of pain, toughness 8 across the board for a lot cheaper. You're not going to beat Death Guard by just outlasting them. And because we don't have such a great mortal wound output, we lack that. We lack the fire. We have good fire, we have accurate fire, we have some high damage fire, but we don't have a lot of volume of fire. And we lack mortal wound capacity with a couple exceptions, but pretty much non-existent against tanks. We don't really have anything that can just do mortal wounds to tanks. So you're not going to outlast the Death Guard army if you're just trying to stay on objectives and outlast them. Between Nurglings and things, it doesn't happen. You have to kill stuff, and that means you have to move your stuff forward. You have to get on those objectives. And so just having a Telemon, a 295 point unit, just kind of clinking away in the backfield, it's just less efficient than having a Caladius to do that. Caladius tank can move 14 inches. Caladius tank can, is a little bit better in the firepower department.
And it costs 225, and it has range of 60 inches, right? So it's
really Adeptus, yeah. So
all right, Ryan, I hate to stop you because you have told me so much right now, but we are reaching the 2-hour mark of the podcast. Right. I think if you will be willing, we could go back and continue on in a part 2 that we make that on a different date. But I'm unfortunately running out of time.
Okay.
So
I think we covered most. I mean, I pretty much talked about most of the stuff I think I was going to talk about, anyways. I kind of talked about Death Guard there for a bit, and that was my last game. So. And really,
I still had some questions for you, but
let's set up a part 2.
Let's set up for part 2. This was very great. I thank you for sharing your knowledge. I can see that you are very dedicated to Custodes and Warhammer 40K. You have put a lot of thought to that. So it's not a random thing that you had such a high scores. It's hard work and a lot of dedication. So,
well, thank you so much for having me on your show here. It was a great time. I enjoyed it.
And thank you for helping me to get back on a jet bike.
yeah, definitely.
Okay, we stay in touch, Ryan.
All right, we'll do. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.